The room was hushed, heavy with the weight of expectation. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, but all eyes were fixed on one man, Justice William Alsup. And there it was, that smirk. A flash of arrogance curled at the edge of his mouth, the kind of grin that didn't need words to speak volumes. It was a smirk that said, "I hold the gavel, I hold the power, and no one in this room can shake me." But power is fragile when it leans on contempt. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, shoulders square, gaze unflinching, her silence louder than any speech. In that moment, it wasn't just a courtroom exchange. It was theater, it was battle, it was history quietly preparing to roar. The smirk wasn't new. Anyone who had followed Alsup's career knew it. That same dismissive look, that same unspoken dismissal of voices he thought beneath him. And yet, today, it felt different. The cameras were watching. The public was watching. And the tension in the air wasn't merely legal, it was moral. For Alsup, that grin was a weapon. For Crockett, it was a spark. He underestimated her resolve, mistaking calm for weakness, silence for surrender. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see behind her steady eyes, was that Crockett had weathered storms far greater than a judge's smirk. She had carried the weight of communities overlooked, voices dismissed, dreams belittled. And when those years of grit converge on a single instant, something unforgettable is bound to erupt. The room itself seemed to lean forward. Viewers at home felt the knot in their stomach tighten. Was this going to be another scene where arrogance walks away unchallenged? Or was this the day someone finally stood tall enough, fierce enough, unapologetic enough to shatter that sneer? Justice Alsup's smirk grew, a small tightening at the corner of his lips, as though daring her to falter. Crockett blinked once, slowly, as if measuring the weight of every second. Silence stretched, unbearable, electric. And then, but the words Crockett unleashed next didn't just wipe that smirk away, they made history. The courtroom was no ordinary arena. On paper, it was a chamber of law. Oak benches, solemn portraits, the echo of centuries of precedent. But on this day, it was something else entirely. It was an arena of clashing ideals, where two very different faces of America stared each other down. On one side, William Alsup, cloaked in the authority of a federal robe, leaned on a history of power and entitlement. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose voice rose from the streets and the people, carrying with her the weight of those who had long been dismissed. This was not a trivial exchange. Every eyebrow raised, every smirk, every pause was loaded with meaning. Alsup's smirk was more than a facial tic. It was a symbol, the embodiment of elitism that believes dignity can be mocked, that truth can be reduced to a punchline. For many watching, that grin wasn't just his. It was the smirk of every boss who underestimated them, every official who brushed them aside, every system that made them feel invisible. And then there was Crockett. She had earned her reputation the hard way, through fire, persistence, and an unwillingness to bow. For her, this wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about showing every immigrant family, every young activist, every person told they didn't belong that dignity has a voice. A fearless voice. Her mere presence in that courtroom was already a statement. I am here, I belong, and I will not be silenced. The stakes reached far beyond those walls. The cameras were rolling, and in an age where a single clip could ricochet across the globe in minutes, what unfolded here would not stay here. Twitter threads were poised, TikTok creators ready, news anchors waiting for sound bites. Millions would not just watch but judge. Was this another chapter of arrogance triumphing, or the long-awaited moment when the tables turned? Alsup believed he knew the answer. His history made him confident. He had smirked his way through hearings before, his dismissive quips and subtle gestures signaling who held the power. Rarely had he been challenged, and rarer still by someone like Crockett. To him, her fearlessness was just another chance to remind her of her place. But those who knew Crockett's story understood something Alsup did not. She thrived when underestimated. Every battle she fought, every sneer she endured had built her into the kind of fighter who didn't just react. She transformed insults into fuel. If Alsup thought he could reduce her to silence with a grin, he had walked straight into the trap of his own arrogance. The audience, both in the courtroom and at home, felt the storm brewing. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was anticipation. It was the quiet before a thunderclap. This wasn't just about Alsup versus Crockett. It was about whether dignity could still stand tall in a room where power sneered. And just when Alsup thought he had the upper hand, the tables began to turn. For decades, Justice William Alsup has walked the halls of power with the quiet confidence of a man who never doubted his place in the hierarchy. To some, he was a formidable jurist, sharp in his reasoning, unwavering in his judgments. But to others, especially those who stood on the margins, his name carried a different weight. It conjured the image of a man who wielded authority not as a guardian of fairness, but as a performance, one punctuated by the ever-present smirk that betrayed his disdain. The smirk wasn't incidental. It was his calling card, the subtle curve of arrogance that let you know he thought he had already won before you even opened your mouth. Colleagues whispered about it, lawyers dreaded it, defendants despised it. It was a mask and a weapon rolled into one, telling the world, I know more than you, I'm better than you, and I will decide your fate. His career was long and storied, yet the stories that defined him were rarely about compassion or humility. They were about the sharpness of his tongue, the dismissiveness of his tone, the casual cruelty of a man who never learned to hide his contempt for those who dared to challenge him. Court transcripts told the tale, quips directed at lawyers he found incompetent, cold retorts to defendants who pleaded for understanding, sarcastic remarks that cut deeper than any ruling. Those who defended him painted him as old school, a man of tradition, unwilling to bend to what they called the softening of justice. But beneath that defense lay a truth. Alsup relished control, and he relished belittling those he believed did not measure up to his standard. To him, the courtroom was a stage, and he was both judge and performer. Consider the countless hearings where young attorneys, eager and idealistic, walked in with carefully prepared arguments, only to be met with Alsup's smirk. One wrong word, one stumble, and the smirk would widen into something more cutting, a sarcastic aside, a rhetorical question designed not to clarify, but to humiliate. Many left his courtroom not only defeated, but disillusioned. It wasn't justice they had faced. It was theater, scripted by a man who seemed to take pleasure in reminding them of their place. And yet, this behavior often went unchecked. Why? Because power protects itself. His colleagues chuckled at his wit, commentators excused his arrogance as candor, and those who bore the brunt of it lacked the platform to fight back. The smirk endured, and with it, the culture of dismissal that it symbolized. But arrogance, like any mask, eventually blinds the wearer. Alsup believed his smirk was invincible, that no one could pierce through the shield of authority he wore. He mistook silence for submission, compliance for respect. What he never understood was that contempt builds resentment, and resentment eventually finds a voice. That voice belonged to Jasmine Crockett. Unlike so many who had stood in front of him before, she wasn't cowed by his smirk. She didn't see it as a wall, but as a crack, proof that his power wasn't grounded in respect, but in ridicule. Crockett had spent her life navigating spaces where smirks like his tried to tell her she didn't belong. Every dismissive glance, every belittling comment had forged her into something unbreakable. Alsup, blind to his own hubris, couldn't recognize the danger in underestimating her. To him, she was just another name, another face in a long career of people he thought he could outmaneuver with a grin and a gavel. What he didn't realize was that the world outside his courtroom had changed. Cameras rolled, social media amplified, and the nation's hunger for dignity over arrogance was at an all-time high. The smirk that had once intimidated now looked out of place, out of time. What once drew laughter now drew outrage. His arrogance, once hidden behind the respect of his office, was laid bare for millions to see. And in that exposure lay his vulnerability. Because every villain, no matter how confident, no matter how untouchable, has a blind spot. And Alsup was about to meet his. Long before the cameras, the hashtags, or the bright lights of Washington, Jasmine Crockett's story began in places that never made headlines. Her roots were stitched into neighborhoods where people worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, where resilience wasn't a choice, but a survival skill. She grew up seeing firsthand the quiet strength of those who refused to quit, even when the odds towered against them. It was here, in the grit of everyday struggle, that Crockett learned her first lesson. Dignity is not handed down from power. It is claimed by those who refuse to bow. Education became her weapon, though it was never easy. While others dismissed her ambitions, she poured herself into books. Late nights spent chasing knowledge that could open doors once slammed shut. She was no stranger to sacrifice. While peers had comfort, she had determination. While others enjoyed privilege, she carved out space with sheer persistence. For Crockett, each page studied wasn't just about grades. It was about proving wrong every voice that ever whispered she wasn't enough. Law called to her because it was never abstract. For Jasmine, the law was personal. She had seen how families could be crushed under its weight, how communities could be silenced by its misuse. Becoming an attorney wasn't about prestige. It was about becoming a shield for those who had no one to defend them. In courtrooms, she was relentless, not because she loved the fight, but because she knew people's lives were on the line. Every case became another chance to say, "You matter. Your voice matters. Your dignity matters." But the path upward was never smooth. She faced sneers from those who believed she didn't belong, questions about her capabilities, and dismissals wrapped in the polite tones of condescension. The smirk she encountered back then looked a lot like the one Alsup wore. And each time, Crockett met them with fire. If they underestimated her, they fueled her. If they mocked her, they made her stronger. Every insult became iron in her spine. Public service was the next step, and it was no accident. Crockett knew the fight for dignity wasn't confined to the courtroom. It belonged in the halls of power. Her entry into politics wasn't born from ambition alone. It was born from necessity. Communities like hers needed someone at the table who spoke their language, who carried their struggles, who didn't just sympathize but understood. And Jasmine, forged in struggle, was ready to carry that banner. The journey into public life brought its own set of storms. Critics called her too loud, too bold, too unpolished. They tried to box her in, to suggest that passion equaled weakness. But Crockett flipped the script. She turned her passion into power, her fearlessness into a brand of authenticity that electrified audiences. People didn't just see a politician, they saw themselves reflected in her, the fighter who refused to be silenced. Her rise was not meteoric in the sense of ease, but it was undeniable. Every step came with pushback, yet she answered with persistence. She won battles others thought unwinnable. She carved space in rooms that were never designed for her. And with each victory, her reputation grew, a woman who would not bend, who carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had already been through the fire. That reputation preceded her into Alsup's courtroom. He may not have recognized it, but those watching knew. They knew Crockett wasn't merely another voice at the mercy of power. She was the culmination of years of being underestimated, disrespected, and dismissed, and turning all of it into fuel. Her presence was living proof that dignity doesn't just survive arrogance. It thrives in defiance of it. And so, when Alsup smirked, what he saw as a weakness was actually a trigger. He thought he had the upper hand, that his authority could diminish her. But he didn't understand the full scope of the woman sitting across from him. That smirk was not a weapon against her. It was the spark that lit the fire she had carried all her life. The audience, if they knew her story, understood the stakes. They saw not just a courtroom confrontation, but the embodiment of a struggle larger than any single hearing. Crockett stood there not just for herself, but for every voice that had ever been silenced, for every community told they didn't matter. Her rise made this moment inevitable. Every lesson, every battle, every scar had led her here. And on this day, those years of fire and fight came down to one devastating line. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as if everyone inside could sense that something was about to ignite. Alsup leaned back in his chair, his robe flowing like a cloak of authority, and let out a low chuckle that echoed a little too loudly. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone convinced he held absolute command. The smirk returned, wider this time, almost daring Crockett to challenge him. His interruptions began small, a clipped phrase here, a dismissive hand wave there. Every time Crockett tried to lay out her argument, Alsup's voice cut across hers. "That's irrelevant. We've heard this before. Counselor, perhaps you should revisit the basics." His tone dripped with condescension, the kind that reduces a room to silence because no one wants to be the next target. To him, it was theater. To her, it was battle. Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze never wavered. Every time his words attempted to derail her, She returned to her point with calm persistence, her voice steady, her presence unshaken. The more he tried to undercut her, the more the contrast sharpened, his arrogance against her dignity, his interruptions against her resolve. Observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some scribbled notes. Others glanced at each other as if asking silently, "Is he really doing this?" The smirk, once subtle, now seemed to dominate his face. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was mockery. It was the grin of a man convinced he had reduced his opponent to silence before she had even spoken her full piece. But Crockett didn't just absorb the blows. She allowed them to reveal his character. Each interruption made him look smaller, not larger. Each dismissive remark made her patience shine brighter. The very arrogance he believed was his strength became a mirror, reflecting back to the room just how much he relied on contempt instead of reason. At one point, he leaned forward, hands clasped, and delivered a line with icy precision. "You're out of your depth here. Let's not waste the court's time." His smirk widened, certain that he had just ended the exchange. A hush fell across the courtroom, not respect for his authority, but anticipation of what might follow. Crockett inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling in measured rhythm. She didn't rush. She didn't snap back. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that broke through the veneer of his smirk. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed across his face, barely visible but real. The tension ratcheted higher. It was no longer just a courtroom exchange, it was a standoff. The kind of standoff where the audience leans forward, knowing the next move could tilt the entire room. The smirk had grown unbearable, the interruptions intolerable, the arrogance suffocating. And then, Crockett struck back. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Every eye in the courtroom locked on Jasmine Crockett as she rose from her seat, the weight of Alsup's dismissive words still hanging in the air. He leaned back, smirk fixed in place, convinced his interruption had broken her stride. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She was calculating. Each second she let the silence linger was deliberate, a pause that turned anticipation into electricity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not just volume but gravity. Calm, deliberate, unwavering. "With all due respect, Judge Alsup," she began, her eyes boring into his. "I don't confuse arrogance for wisdom, and I don't confuse mockery for justice." The words landed like a gavel strike. A ripple moved through the room. Heads turned. Pens froze mid-scribble. For the first time, Alsup's smirk faltered, just slightly, as though the confidence behind it had been dented. Crockett didn't let up. She leaned forward, her cadence steady, her words sharpened by conviction. "I came here to speak truth, not to be silenced by a smirk. That smirk may have dismissed others before me, but it won't dismiss the people I represent. They've endured far worse than this." She gestured broadly, her hand sweeping toward the gallery, as though to summon the unseen millions outside those walls who shared her fight. Alsup shifted in his chair. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to those watching closely, it was the first crack in his armor. The arrogance that had seemed unshakable now looked brittle. The room itself seemed to inhale as Crockett continued. Her voice built momentum, not in anger, but in power. "You can interrupt me, you can dismiss me, you can even smirk at me, but every time you do, you prove my point. This is not justice. This is not dignity. This is performance. And today, that performance ends." Gasps erupted, a soft chorus from the gallery. Even the court reporter's hands seemed to hesitate above the keys, caught in the shock of what had just been said. Crockett was no longer simply defending her argument. She was dismantling the very posture Alsup had hidden behind for years. Crockett sat back down, her composure intact, her expression resolute. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her restraint only amplified the impact. It wasn't about theatrics for her. It was about truth, and truth had just cut through arrogance like a blade. Alsup stared down at his notes, avoiding her gaze. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was no longer the center of gravity in his own courtroom. The authority he had cloaked himself in seemed thinner, almost transparent. Meanwhile, the world beyond those walls was already ablaze. Clips of Crockett's comeback were spreading like wildfire. TikTok edits looped the moment with captions like, "This is how you shut down arrogance." Twitter hashtags emerged within minutes. Hashtag Smirk shattered and hashtag Crockett mic drop. Instagram Reels paired her line with thunderous applause tracks. Even late-night pundits were already circling, preparing to feature the exchange as a cultural flashpoint. But the true measure wasn't just in the virality. It was in the way people felt watching it. Viewers who had endured condescension at work, students who had been dismissed by professors, immigrants who had been mocked for their accents, they all saw themselves in Crockett. Her words weren't just a clapback to a judge. They were validation for every person who had ever faced a smirk that told them they didn't belong. Inside the chamber, the echoes of her words lingered long after she had finished. The once dominant smirk had vanished, replaced by an awkward stillness that Alsup could not disguise. He reached for his gavel but hesitated, as though even the symbol of his authority no longer carried weight. Crockett didn't need to say more. She had already won, and what happened next left the courtroom in stunned silence, and the internet in flames. The moment Crockett's words left her lips, the courtroom might as well have transformed into a broadcasting studio. In an age where every gasp, every glance, every syllable can become content, her mic drop was destined to explode far beyond those walls. And explode it did. Within minutes, phones buzzed as live tweets spread the quote like wildfire. Power does not belong to the smirk. Power belongs to the people, and I am their voice. The line became an instant rallying cry. Twitter's trending tab lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Smirk shattered. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag voice of the people. On TikTok, creators wasted no time. One looped the clip of Alsup's smirk dissolving into discomfort with the caption, "When arrogance meets its match." Another layered Crockett's line over swelling cinematic music, turning a courtroom exchange into something that felt like a Hollywood trailer. Within hours, millions of views stacked up. YouTube compilations followed. Titles like Jasmine Crockett Destroys Smirking Judge racked up hundreds of thousands of views overnight. Comment sections read like a chorus of validation. I felt that in my soul. That smirk reminded me of every boss who underestimated me. Thank you, Jasmine, for shutting it down. This wasn't just a clapback. This was justice. Even Instagram Reels amplified the moment, pairing Crockett's words with images of civil rights marches, immigrant families holding hands, and protesters holding signs. The effect was cinematic, weaving her comeback into the broader tapestry of America's struggle for dignity. Meanwhile, Alsup's image became a meme, the once smug smirk now immortalized in freeze frames captioned with biting humor. When you realize your arrogance has an expiration date, that moment you thought you won, and then Crockett spoke. What had once been his weapon was now a punchline. Commentators across the political spectrum weighed in. Progressive voices hailed it as a watershed moment, a rare instant when truth cut through institutional arrogance. Crockett didn't just win an argument, one anchor declared. She reminded America what dignity looks like under pressure. Even some moderate voices, usually hesitant to celebrate confrontation, admitted the power of the exchange. It's not often you see a smirk disappear in real time, joked one late-night host. The clip replayed to roaring laughter. But beyond the jokes, there was a serious undercurrent. Editorials framed Crockett's moment as symbolic of a generational shift, a new era where voices once sidelined now commanded the stage. One op-ed captured it perfectly. That wasn't a courtroom. That was America deciding who it wants to be. For ordinary viewers, the reaction was deeply personal. Immigrant parents shared the clip with their children, writing, "This is why we fight. This is why we belong." College students posted reaction videos in tears, explaining how Crockett's words gave them the courage to stand taller in their own classrooms and workplaces. Workers who had endured ridicule from arrogant managers found catharsis, commenting, "That smirk looked just like my boss's." Watching it vanish felt like justice for all of us. Crockett herself trended not just as a politician, but as a symbol, a living reminder that courage doesn't always roar, but sometimes calmly cuts arrogance down to size. Her poise under fire became a lesson, her words a mantra. Clips of her line were replayed in gyms, on car radios, at community centers. It wasn't just a moment, it was movement fuel. Alsup, by contrast, found himself mocked in places he never expected. Editorial cartoons skewered his smirk. Commentators noted his silence afterward as the real defeat. Even those who once admired his sharp wit now described him as out of touch, his arrogance out of step with a country tired of being belittled. His image, once synonymous with authority, was now a cautionary tale of how quickly power can evaporate when it leans on contempt. And yet, the most important reaction wasn't laughter or applause. It was the feeling of empowerment that rippled across households, campuses, and workplaces. Crockett's words became a touchstone, a reassurance that dignity could still pierce through the armor of arrogance. People didn't just cheer, they reflected. They saw in her a mirror of their own struggles, their own silences, their own yearning to speak truth without fear. The internet flamed with memes and applause, but beneath the noise lay something quieter, more profound. Because beyond the memes, something deeper had shifted in America's conversation. When the noise of the memes fades, when the hashtags drift off the trending page, what remains is not just the drama of a courtroom clash. It is the lesson buried inside it. Jasmine Crockett's exchange with William Alsup was never merely about a smirk. It was about what that smirk represented and what her words destroyed. Alsup's grin was the grin of arrogance, the unspoken assumption that power can mock, dismiss, and belittle without consequence. For years, that expression had gone unchecked in countless rooms of authority. It symbolized the smirk of the employer who thinks your accent makes you less intelligent, the teacher who doubts your potential, the official who reduces your identity to a footnote. It was more than a facial expression. It was a worldview, one that says dignity is expendable. Crockett's comeback shattered that worldview in real time. She didn't need to raise her voice or descend into the same pettiness. She cut through arrogance with calm conviction, proving that dignity, when wielded with courage, is stronger than mockery. Her line wasn't just a rebuke to one man. It was a reminder to millions that arrogance falls apart when confronted with truth. His image, once synonymous with authority, was now a cautionary tale of how quickly power can evaporate when it leans on contempt. And yet, the most important reaction wasn't laughter or applause. It was the feeling of empowerment that rippled across households, campuses, and workplaces. Crockett's words became a touchstone, a reassurance that dignity could still pierce through the armor of arrogance. People didn't just cheer, they reflected. They saw in her a mirror of their own struggles, their own silences, their own yearning to speak truth without fear. The internet flamed with memes and applause, but beneath the noise lay something quieter, more profound. Because beyond the memes, something deeper had shifted in America's conversation. When the noise of the memes fades, when the hashtags drift off the trending page, what remains is not just the drama of a courtroom clash. It is the lesson buried inside it. Jasmine Crockett's exchange with William Alsup was never merely about a smirk. It was about what that smirk represented and what her words destroyed. Alsup's grin was the grin of arrogance, the unspoken assumption that power can mock, dismiss, and belittle without consequence. For years, that expression had gone unchecked in countless rooms of authority. It symbolized the smirk of the employer who thinks your accent makes you less intelligent, the teacher who doubts your potential, the official who reduces your identity to a footnote. It was more than a facial expression. It was a worldview, one that says dignity is expendable. Crockett's comeback shattered that worldview in real time. She didn't need to raise her voice or descend into the same pettiness. She cut through arrogance with calm conviction, proving that dignity, when wielded with courage, is stronger than mockery. Her line wasn't just a rebuke to one man. It was a reminder to millions that arrogance falls apart when confronted with truth. This is the essence of justice. Not simply laws on paper, but the affirmation that every person has worth that cannot be erased by a smirk. Respect is not a gift from authority. It is a right carried in the heart of every individual. Resilience isn't about avoiding confrontation. It's about standing steady when the smirk dares you to falter. Crockett's presence embodied that resilience, turning a courtroom into a stage for universal truth. For those who watched, the message was deeply personal. It wasn't just Crockett speaking. It was their story being told through her. The immigrant parent who has endured mockery but never wavered. The young worker talked down to in a meeting but still showing up the next day. The student who's been underestimated but refuses to quit. Crockett's voice carried all of theirs. Her dignity became their vindication. And this is why the moment matters so much. It tells us that arrogance does not have the final word. That mockery, no matter how smug, is fragile. That truth, spoken with clarity, can silence even the most powerful smirk in the room. When we step back, we see that this wasn't just political theater. It was a blueprint, a reminder that when we encounter arrogance in our own lives, we are not powerless. We can stand firm. We can speak truth. We can dismantle the smirk with dignity. Because Crockett's comeback was not just about her. It was about us. It was about every person watching who needed proof that their voice, too, can matter in the face of dismissal. It was about the universal struggle between arrogance and respect, between silence and truth. And that is why the clip continues to resonate. Not just because it was dramatic, not just because it was viral, but because it validated something deep within people, the desire to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. Crockett showed that validation is possible, even against the most entrenched symbols of power.